New Orleans is globally recognized for its culture, music, art, carnival traditions, food. They form the identity not only of the city, but arguably of Louisiana itself. Yet many of the people who create that culture operate without the legal, financial, or institutional protections that exist in other industries. They are individuals navigating contracts, intellectual property disputes, rising costs, unstable income, and institutions that often celebrate culture symbolically while underinvesting in the people creating it. What does it actually take to sustain culture? Welcome to Brungert Law's Lanyard, where we provide a little extra perspective through conversations with individuals from across the spectrum of society. I'm Maurice Brungart, your host. I enjoy engaging with experienced, knowledgeable, and passionate people for the opportunity it affords to enrich our understanding of the world through their eyes. The more we learn, the more likely we can become better versions of ourselves and guide others towards the same. Today, we have two special guests, Ashlye Keaton and Jean Meneray, who are from the Ella Project. Ashlye Keaton is an intellectual property and entertainment attorney, educator, and cultural advocate based in New Orleans. She co-founded the Ella Project, a nonprofit providing pro bono legal and business services to Louisiana artists, musicians, and culture bearers. Over more than 2 decades, she has become one of the leading legal advocates for New Orleans culture, particularly through her work protecting artist intellectual property rights and advocating for policies impacting the city's cultural ecosystem. She also serves as an adjunct professor at both Tulane Law School and University of New Orleans and is widely recognized for her work involving Mardi Gras Indian copyright protections. Jean Meneray, also co-founder of the Ella Project, is a longtime arts administrator, cultural advocate. A native Orleanian and Tulane graduate, Jean has worked extensively at the intersection of culture, entrepreneurship, and economic development, including leadership roles with the Arts Council of New Orleans, the Louisiana Crafts Guild, and Young Aspirations Young Artists, otherwise known as YAYA. Through the Ella Project, he has helped Louisiana artists and musicians navigate the business realities of sustaining creative careers while advocating for policies that strengthen the region's cultural economy. He also has taught arts business at the University of New Orleans and currently serves as chair of the Louisiana State Arts Council. Ashlye, Jean, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Maurice.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us.
Well, why don't you share with the audience a bit how you were initially influenced that set you on the path where you find yourselves today?
Sure. I actually was had a private practice after graduating from law school and worked at a boutique entertainment law firm and represented a lot of musicians and other folks in the New Orleans arts community. And Jean and I met Jean when I was still an intern in law school when I was volunteering for the local arts council. So I was volunteering as a legal intern, working to try to help match some of the arts council's clients with lawyers. And following that experience, Jean and I partnered with another organization called the Tipitinas Foundation and Tulane Law School at their Department of Public Service. We partnered to develop the programming that we still operate today. We called it the Entertainment Law Legal Assistance Project back then, but now it's just the Ella Project, and that's where we get started.
Jean, what about you? What set you on the path that brought you here today?
Yeah, Maurice, you mentioned in your intro, I did grow up in the city of New Orleans, and I grew up in New Orleans in the 1990s. And at the time, I think New Orleans was undergoing a very challenging part of its existence. The city's economy had been significantly damaged by the 1987 oil bust. There was a pretty significant crime problem the city had. And what I saw was that a lot of the people who I went to school with, both in high school and in university, were leaving, and they were going to other cities, even though they loved the culture of New Orleans and they really wanted to live here. But economically and quality of life was bringing them to other markets. And so I looked at whatever my skills were, and it really came from a selfish vision of I wanted more of my friends to be here. And so I said, okay, well, what can I do? And I looked at it and I said, well, we all really love the culture here. And we all think that the culture can be something that can bring in people from around the country and can keep people who want to be in New Orleans to stay in New Orleans. And so there was a job opening at the time at the local arts council. And, they weren't offering a lot of money, but they were willing to take me on. And that began work in arts business. So that was the Arts Council's arts business program initially, and came in there, as Ashlye said, we met in the early 2000s where she was a student, and then we were really trying to devise a more effective pro bono legal program. And we were able to do that till about 2016 with that as a program of Tulane, Tipitina's Foundation, the Arts Council of New Orleans. And then we realized it was time for us to spread our wings a little bit. So about 10 years ago, we spun off and became an independent nonprofit focused on those core tenets of, direct pro bono legal assistance for artists, arts business development, and cultural advocacy.
Well, when y'all got the YAYA project up and running, what was that first year like for both y'all? And Gene, we'll let you start first.
So I think for us as an independent organization, it was interesting because we'd taken our time. As I'd said, we were an embedded program for about 12 years. And so we already had a list of potential supporters. We had a program model that we believed worked. But it was the time to then actually launch independently and figure out some of the other things that we never had to deal with previously, dealing with the standard non-fun part of starting an organization, payroll and insurance and office leases and, equipment purchases and all that. But, because we'd taken our time, because we'd done our research, Ashlye and I began talking about making the move to spin this off into an independent organization probably 5 years before we actually did it. So I think that we'd taken time, we'd done our homework, and we prepared some of our supporters that this may be something that would happen so they could come over with us. As a pro bono organization, we only exist through the support of individuals, foundations, government entities that believe in our work. And, I always like to say, hire us to do the work for them, of making sure that artists have full representation and can compete in the global marketplace. And so, taking that and becoming like, well, we're really good programmers, but now we also are running an organization. There's a little bit of a learning curve, but I think because we did take the time in the beginning, it wasn't as steep as it might be for some.
Ashlye, for you, what misconceptions do people have about the mechanics behind the culture of New Orleans, specifically the musicians and the visual artist?
The mechanics. Well, I think there's a lot of misconceptions. There's a misconception that New Orleans artists don't want to engage in the business of their art, the business of their music. And I think a lot of that is simply because there's not a whole lot of business infrastructure in the city, and there's just not historically not a lot of resources. But my experience is that my clients are hungry for more knowledge, and they want to they strive to develop their content, into what is ultimately a business, right? Because you're a business if you're an artist, whether, you have an independent entity or not. And so, that's one of the things that, we focus hard on, which is to, help our clients identify the frameworks and the operating protocol for doing business, whether, they're exploiting their content in an online marketplace, whether they're distributing music, whether they're, not just performing, but, performing gigs. Some of our musician clients are, some of them record music and some of them just perform live, right? And so we like to help work with our clients, intimately to help them to develop models that work for them, in a way that, that eases, what is, widely considered, the burden of operating a business, right? Because these days, you have to wear a ton of different hats just to, get your music out there, right? Or whether, or to, license your artwork, or to, produce a documentary film, right? Because you're the marketer, you're the business owner, you're the marketeer, you are the contractor, right? But you're also the content creator. And so, there's that balancing act of operating a business, while you're also in the creative process. And we like to ensure that our clients do have access to the resources to engage in best practices, to ensure that they can control their content, that they don't give it away, that they have that they maximize earning potential and opportunities, and that they maintain leverage in transacting with third parties, because most people who are doing business are engaging in transactions to some degree. And the idea is to work very proactively with our clients to establish these models based on best business practices, and to prevent disaster from happening to the extent that we can, to the extent that it's foreseeable. When I was in my private practice, one of the unfortunate lessons that I learned that inspired me to get into this line of work was that some of the most talented musicians, for instance, in the city, some of them are being household names, right? You know a lot of them. It wouldn't access legal resources because they couldn't afford it, and they would come to my law office, with a problem that was so massive that that it was almost impossible, in some situations, to untangle. And with our model of providing services, we're able to kind of ward that sort of situation off by providing these services without the cost that's normally associated with it. So that with hope, if our clients seek our representation before they're in a problem, that'll prevent them from getting in such a bad mess, where there's no justice whatsoever. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think it's probably time for me to stop talking. So
Well, then we'll give Jean a chance to comment. Can you think of comparable cities to New Orleans that actually have, it sounds a bit like an cliche, but an ecosystem that actually supports its artistic culture?
It's a good question. I think that it depends on where you look at that. There's certainly plenty of cities that put in more government funding than New Orleans does. There's plenty of cities with larger foundation communities than our city has. And, there's cities where, especially at the high end, the cities have invested in very fabulous museums, symphony orchestras, opera houses. But when you look at the day to day, I think that New Orleans supports its artists through the people of New Orleans, who are going to go out to the shows, who are going to attend the second line parades, who are going to go out to the festivals and not just watch the music, but buy from the food vendors as well. We have a large art market scene in the city of New Orleans where artists are paid a nominal fee, setting up in the heat and the rain sometimes and selling their original art. So it doesn't always have to go through the galleries. And I think that's what makes it interesting. So while we certainly see a great need for further government support of the arts in the city, statewide, Louisiana is 46 per capita in funding the arts. That's not where we would want to be, and especially from the New Orleans perspective, because so much cultural activity comes through the city of New Orleans. A better number for Louisiana supporting the arts is better for the city. The city has made some progress in the last couple of years in setting up new funding mechanisms, which I think is great. Regulations, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. I think that it's probably an easy argument that the city is overly bureaucratic to a lot of industries. Arts is one of them. There are certainly aspects to street parading, to live music, to public performance that sometimes the government is more harmful than helpful. But overall, I think what you see is that the population embraces the culture so deeply and so innately, and it's so much a part of their day-to-day existence. And for so many of them, it's the reason that they're here. I mean, think about all the people who you've talked to who you go, why did you move to New Orleans? And they say, well, I came for Mardi Gras one time and I just realized I had to be here, or I came for the Jazz Fest, or, I found myself at a nightclub on Frenchman Street at 2 a.m. in a sweaty July and realized like this was the place that I could be happy. And so we know that the population supports culture, and we know that the culture is integral to their life here. So I think we don't support it in the traditional ways that you would find in a Houston or New York City, but we do in our own way, and I think that it works.
Ashlye, what are some of the common legal issues you find that your clients come to the Ella Project with?
Sure. Most of the legal issues are around the protection of their content, right? So they're intellectual property driven. So, the interest that they have in their copyright, and their branding for the trademarks. Right of publicity is a common one, especially these days. People are using, name, image, and likeness. People that outside of the industry, even that's a hot topic these days. But I do a lot of boring contract work, right? I mean, because you have to, when you're transacting around, the content. I mean, you have to have there's contracts that are negotiated and drafted and that's regardless of the nature of or the creative nature of the work. That's just like mundane legal stuff, right? So a lot of contract drafting, licensing, that sort of thing. So filmmakers, if I have a documentary filmmaker that comes to me with a project and doesn't have any contracts, then I help them get together the independent contractor agreements that they have with their crew and with the camera people and the editors and all of the people that are involved in the development of a film. And then I help them clear the music that they're using in their film. You have to clear the compositions and the sound recordings, right, for that kind of usage. I help people with distribution agreements for online streaming platforms and that sort of thing. So while most of the work is specific to intellectual property and certain creative content, the actual legal services involve just a lot of transactions. And every now and then, I was joking at some point, because last year was like a really contentious year. Like I had, for whatever reason, I don't know if Mercury was in retrograde the whole year or what, but I don't know how many cease and desist letters and letters of demand that went out last year. That was unusual though, but we do have, disputes that come up, and we work to resolve them, and we have a pretty good rate of resolution too. So, because I kind of like that, but yeah, that's, just a lot of transactions and a lot of negotiating.
Have you found the legal issues over the last 20 years to have sort of remained the same, or have you seen a transition in terms of the issues they come to you with?
Well, some are the same. when it comes to protecting content, a lot of that hasn't changed fundamentally, right? But I do think that our clients, the issues that we see today are more complicated in some ways than they were at the outset. And a lot of that is just because I think that, with access to information, our clients they have more complicated questions, and they have a better understanding, like a baseline for engaging in transactions and for doing business. And because of that, the more elevated, they are insofar as the background that they have, the more complicated, the issues are going to be for me to reason out with them, right? But it's a good thing. It's not that they're overly complicated. They're just more complex, and that's because our clients are actually doing business. And I think that to some degree, with the democratization of access to technology, I just held up my phone. I realize I'm blurred, but everyone has access to the internet now. Everyone's got a smartphone. For years, most of my clients still don't have PCs, right? But everyone has a phone now. So people are able to access information that they weren't able to for decades, right? And so that's contributed to some of the shifts that we've seen as well. So
Speaking of legal issues, and Gene, I'm going to borrow Ashlye for just a few minutes longer, and tell the audience a little bit about the Mardi Gras Indians and the copyright protection that you helped them with.
sure. So Mardi Gras Indians, won't get into the cultural background or their history, because there's an unwritten rule that you let the Mardi Gras Indians explain their history and their development as a culture, but they make these elaborate hand sewn, like gorgeous suits that are not what you and I think of as a suit, right? They're these ornate, hand beaded, intricate works of work. They're sculptural works, is what they are. But they're worn as part of their cultural ritual, and these suits are made typically once a year, and it takes hours and hours and hours. Some Mardi Gras Indians spend up to 40 hours a week, especially as Mardi Gras draws near, and they wear these suits 3 times a year on Mardi Gras, Super Sunday, and St. Joseph's Night, typically. And so these suits can weigh up to like 150 pounds. They're typically between 75 and 150 pounds, depending on the scope and the scale. And they're just masterful, beautiful displays of artistry. And for years, for decades, some would argue centuries. Well, not centuries, given that the camera is only I forget what year the camera was invented, but often was the case, and still can be the case, that people would sell photographs of Mardi Gras Indians without their permission and without any form of compensation. I think the bigger issue was without permission, and it was inequitable because some of these photographs were going for quite a bit of money, right? And at one point, one of the Mardi Gras Indians came to me and asked what to do about it, and it was very obvious to me. My mother was an art teacher, and I said, "Well, that's copyright infringement, right?" Because I knew the culture well enough to know how they developed their suits, and that they were born out of artistry, right? And I knew that the Mardi Gras Indians wear clothing under their suits because these suits are so dysfunctional that they have to be removed when they're being adorned, when they're being worn on one of these 3 days a year, because they're you'd have a heat stroke otherwise, right? So you have a crew that follows you and helps you like remove them so you can like get a breath, and then and then, you put it back on and then you go back out there, right, with the crew. And so I never thought of them as costumes, right? Because costumes are functional and therefore they're not subject to copyright protection. I said, these are sculptures. They're just instead of being on a mannequin or being on a, 2x4 in a museum, they're, worn over a person. And so we argued, and we didn't have to argue with the Copyright Office. I filed an application for copyright registration of a suit and secured that, and I knew that they were copyrightable, but I had to frame it the right way so that the Copyright Office would agree, and that required a little bit of just not so much maneuvering, but figuring out what language to use so that they would not consider these works costumes, right, and deny the registration. But we were able to successfully secure copyright registration, which had transformational effects, as it turns out. There's a Mardi Gras Indian that's featured at the Venice Biennale, which is considered the premier art biennial in the world right now. And I mean, that was just this was not part of the dialogue that was happening, not even 10 years ago. But, I think that within this culture, I think it was obvious that they were creating artwork, but I think that securing this registration and really couching the creation of these suits as more than just, it's not to undermine the cultural ritual, because that's the most important part, but as part of the creation of works of fine art has had tremendous effects. We had a Mardi Gras Indian designed the logo for the Super Bowl a couple of years ago here. I mean, these suits are being are on display in museums, like world-class museums, across the globe. And 20 years ago, that wouldn't have even been heard of. And I'm not suggesting that the copyright was the driving force, but a lot did change once the Indian community had legal recourse, and there were conversations being had about the suits being considered works of art, and for whatever reason that was not a conversation that I bore witness to anyway. And I know that most folks in New Orleans didn't think of the suits as works of art back then because they weren't sought after as works of art, but they are now. So that's been really, really, really inspiring to watch develop over time.
The artist you were talking about, the Mardi Gras Indian that went to Venice, Big Chief Demon Melanchon, right?
Yeah, Melanchon, Big Chief Demon.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Jean, so a couple of weeks ago, the Louisiana legislature sent a couple of bills to Governor Landry to sign in support of the aerospace industry and providing all these incentives to So, Gene, as I was saying, a couple of bills were sent to the governor, Louisiana, in support of the aerospace industry, and a lot of tax incentives and whatnot. With that in mind, do you think Louisiana underestimates the degree to which its artistic culture drives tourism, hospitality, and the small business ecosystem?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that, in some ways, we should know better. But because it is decentralized, it's not necessarily as easy as it is when you put up, a plant where you could say this plant has 2,000 jobs attached to it. a lot of our people are small businesses. Now we know how many tourists it brings in, but again, I think that it's also important to think about how many people it keeps here. How many people decide that they want to become full-time residents of Louisiana or remain full-time residents of Louisiana because the culture is here. And that's why it's so essential for government, for economic development, for nonprofit leaders, universities to understand that this is our leading asset. This is the advantage that so many other states would kill for, and we have it. And like a lot of things, when that's the case, you take it for granted. And I think that our leaders do take it for granted. And I wish they wouldn't. There've been some, as I said, positive changes, especially at the city level over the last 10 years or so. There's slight progress at the state, but the progress is slight. The the need to really come in here and treat it like the world-class asset that it is, that should be treated with the same reverence that we treat professional sports or oil and gas, to me has always been self-evident, but it has not been the case that that's how it's been treated in the political arena, and I think we've missed opportunities there.
What would you recommend that we do differently?
I mean, so to begin with, one of the major things that states do is they're a funder, and funding is important because it makes sure that arts gets into unrepresented areas. The French Quarter doesn't necessarily need tons of art grants, but there are plenty of parishes in Louisiana where this money is the difference between an event taking place and not taking place, because they don't have the corporate base. They can't charge high price tickets for their performance, whether it be a play, whether it be a festival, and then especially arts funding supports after school activities. We all know that Louisiana has lagged in arts education in school. There has been a lot of nonprofits that have picked up the ball and provided a lot of arts education outside of school hours. The Jazz and Heritage Foundation here in New Orleans does a great job with that. Kid Smart in New Orleans does a great job with that. There's a legion of these nonprofits that do it, but they are, like many arts nonprofits, they're not incredibly well funded. The staff is usually pulled into doing 6 or 7 different jobs because everyone is, it's a ship of 2 or 3, and everyone's involved with making sure everything happens. Adequate state funding makes sure that those programs exist, not just in the Garden District of New Orleans, but in Caldwell Parish, in Tensas Parish, in Cameron Parish. And that's what you have seen other states do. It's kind of embarrassing, I think, for us to say that right now, Mississippi is funding their arts council at twice the level that we are. And there's no reason for that. Mississippi is the poorest state in the union. We're not very high, but we're not that. If Mississippi can do it, Louisiana certainly can too. And by missing that opportunity, I think it does take away from making sure that art gets in the hands of all our citizens. And to me, that's a shame.
What do you think are the biggest threats to New Orleans culture right now? And I'll throw a few things out. Is it housing cost, insurance, AI, institutional neglect, all of the above and more?
Yeah, I think it's all the above, but I think mostly it's just livability, it's affordability. Gene was talking about people who come to New Orleans and just stay. I was one of those people. I am one of those people. Been here a very long time, but and I wouldn't suggest that I wouldn't be one of those people today, but it'd be a whole lot harder for me now because this New Orleans, I think one of the reasons why our culture continues to thrive or has is because it's affordable, right? I mean, it's a great place to live. We're surrounded by beautiful architecture. It's a port city, but it's just so affordable. You could live here with the feeling that you were in, what Gene described as a cultural mecca, and, pay your bills, right? And I don't know how much, I know that it's so much less affordable than it used to be. That's no secret, but it's strikingly so. And it's, compounded by a lot of different things, including the insurance crisis that you referenced just now, which of course is made worse by, the infrastructure here, which is crumbling at best. And, I think people are just getting fed up. They're getting fed up because, what worked even back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I mean, this, including like drainage, right, which doesn't work now at all. It wasn't always the best, but it wasn't the worst, right? So we're now living in a city that is completely busted, right? To a large degree when it comes to functionality, right? There's dysfunction everywhere, but we're paying so much for it because of all of the increased costs. I mean, universally, that the increased costs that are universal to all Americans, but that are particular to a coastal city like New Orleans, and one that is, historically vulnerable to, devastating climate, um, uh, actions, not actions, devastating, well, climate change, but also, big hurricanes, right? And other things that make the city especially vulnerable. And it's, the housing costs right now are just insane. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's a big threat to the continuity of our culture, because I think, again, one of the reasons why New Orleans has been so attractive has been its affordability, and we're no longer in that position.
Deal.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And just to jump on, I think the infrastructure is the most important issue, because I also think it's the most fixable. Whereas, governments have mixed records in being able to address housing affordability. It's a private market in many times. Infrastructure is not. So being able to get the streets working, being able to get the stoplights working, being able to work on drainage so that the quality of life is improved, those are things government can do and hopefully is doing, where you could actually see within 10 years market improvement. And also, if they're not doing it, it falls on them too. So it's less about like, oh, it's a world market, it's really complicated. It's like, no, you guys, this is your job to do it. And if you do it, I think that it will allow more people to stay here and attract more people here. And that's obviously one of our major goals.
What do y'all think of like the recent article that came out? And it started almost at the local level, and it was about the slow erosion and the movement of the coastline inland, and that here in 150 years, New Orleans was going to be underwater, and now is the time to evacuate. And that report, a couple of weeks later, now showed up on the CNN website. And I read that, and I also thought this doesn't help New Orleans at all, because you're not talking about in the same report, well, in that case, Miami's also going to be underwater at the same time. And you're not saying Miami needs to evacuate. So do you find that sometimes New Orleans has to constantly battle stereotypes?
And I think that that's unfortunate. And I think that we personally reject the doomerism that's involved there. And the idea that, well, if you do nothing, this is going to happen in 150 years. Well, yeah, yes, that's probably true. So don't do nothing. And I think that should be easy for everyone to understand, and hopefully they do, and hopefully it's taken in that way, where you should have a call to action. There are things that you should be aware of, but the idea that, oh, the battle is lost. I mean, no one who ever starts a nonprofit thinks the battle's lost. It's not in our nature. We're optimistic people by nature, because we believe that we can affect social change. So we're not going to be the ones who are going to give up first. We're probably going to be the ones who give up last.
The New Orleans Music Census, the Ella Project participated in that. Can y'all elaborate what the census was about, your role, and then more importantly, what did the census reveal?
Okay, well, I guess I'll tackle this one. So, the census was just it was exactly what a census is. It was a survey of the health of our of the music industry, and including, musicians and music businesses, right? So it was a questionnaire where, people who were filling out the form they answered some basic questions about, their income, and, their quality of life, and their general happiness in New Orleans. And from that, the city was able to mine some data about the actual reality of a working musician or a music business, like a small venue in New Orleans. I think, for years we speculated a lot about, what it was like, what the circumstances were around, the music community here. And what the census did was, in many ways, confirm some of that speculation, but it provided, real answers to questions that were raised in connection with the viability of the music scene here.
Yeah, Maurice, you talked about our role. I think it was important for us to play a role to help get the word out to as many musicians, many people who were involved professionally, because it wasn't just musicians, it also was, if you were a booking agent for a club, or music attorneys, or publicists, or any one of those likes as well. And, one of the nice things about it is because it was developed by a friend of ours named Don Pitts, and his company, Sound Music Cities. He's done these all over the country, and the questions are the same. And so you get a really nice apples to apples comparison where you can look at how New Orleans compares to Nashville or Austin, Texas, or even places in Louisiana like Lafayette. And to me, that was sort of its great function, was that we could get data and know how we were doing compared to everybody else. And I think, to no one's real surprise, we're doing well in some things, and there's a lot of work to do in other aspects as well. The economic angle is still a major hurdle. It's hard to make a living playing music in this city, but it also can be done. It's not that it's impossible either. I think people saw a great desire for more opportunities, more professional development, more ability to, get their work outside of the city. But then, as Ashlye mentioned too, when we were talking about the livability, those concerns were raised as well. And I think that, one of the great potentials that New Orleans or any other city has when attracting artists is that these days, for the most part, you can do your art anywhere. You don't have to be necessarily in New York or Los Angeles to do it. You can do it wherever you want. But there's a flip side to that too, is that you can do it anywhere. And so you have to make sure that the city is hospitable and supportive for the artist, or else they could go somewhere else. And the census revealed that, and I think that it's a charge we all take pretty seriously.
You said in some areas it was revealed that we're doing pretty well, or New Orleans is doing pretty well. Could you identify what areas?
I think when you see there's a general appreciation that people found for their work amongst other citizens. They felt like that they were supported by the community, even if that didn't necessarily mean they're supported by the public sector. That there were opportunities, especially as far as festivals and live music was concerned. That there's more recording that you think. While it's certainly not a hub of recording and never will be, but they're working studios in town that are top flight and can put products out there. So I think that put us in a place where we were like, okay, and especially because, again, we're comparing it to apples to apples. A lot of times you're thinking, well, in this other community, everything's perfect. And then you look and you say, okay, well, here's how we do shape up to Austin as far as public perception and how the musicians feel welcomed. Okay, this is pretty good actually. That there are these other business opportunities that are not what you're going to find in New York and Los Angeles, but aren't nil either. And I think sometimes the perception is it's nil, and it's not nil. It's develop. It needs to be developed further, but it's not nothing. And that sort of put numbers behind that sentiment.
Uh, Ashley, question. Do you find that artists are signing agreements they fundamentally do not understand?
Sure. Absolutely, to the extent that they are, when if they're not accessing, an attorney, then most of these contracts are super complicated, right? They can be. Not all of them are, but a lot of them are, and I mean, they contain legal terminology that I wouldn't expect an artist to understand. I wouldn't expect anyone to understand outside of practicing the law. So absolutely. But if they're seeking our services, then they shouldn't be signing anything they don't completely understand. And that's what my job is.
Over time, the different artists that y'all have interacted with, whether it's music or visual or whatnot, have y'all found there to be extraordinarily talented artists uh, born and bred in New Orleans, but they've left because they simply cannot survive economically in the city?
Sometimes people, sometimes people leave here and they move to Los Angeles. There's a lot of industry out there. There's a lot of resources, a lot of business infrastructure in Nashville and New York. But a lot of people like it in New Orleans enough to stay here. So really just depends.
Yeah, I would dovetail on that. I think that there's certainly plenty who look for economic opportunities elsewhere, but then you have to look at the flip side as well. The great sculptor Lynn Emery always talked about how she had to be in New Orleans to do her work, not because she was drawn to this culture that we necessarily love, although she did, but getting her outside of the New York art scene was key to having her have the sort of peace and quiet to develop her work authentically without thinking that, oh, well, I have to compete with this next artist and make sure that I'm featured in the next hot gallery show, because her pieces were large and took years to develop. And it was like, I can develop my work authentically down here. And I think that you see that with a lot of artists, that the opportunity to not be in more of a rat race type of situation can work out very well. But others are going to prefer that. One of the things is that New Orleans is not for everybody. It's never going to be for everybody, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be for everybody. There are people that are gonna dig it, but there are others that it's not going to be what they're looking for, and that's fine. We don't ever expect it to be that.
Do y'all find that local artists, and by local I also include those that have migrated to the city, are concerned about AI in their creative works?
Yeah, I think everyone is concerned about AI right now. So, I mean, it's whatever, it's all the rage. It's all anyone can talk about, right? So, you
Yeah.
know, how are they going to use it? Whether they're going to be, replaced by, the technology, or whether, people are going to um, dig into to the authenticity, right? And I think that, I there's obviously major challenges with having a robot that can do what a human can do. But I think that ultimately, I hope that most consumers are going to want to experience art um, that is more authentic. We'll see.
Gene, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Ashley, and I think that a lot of times these things they kind of figure themselves out. I mean, I remember in the early 2000s, there was a great concern with what we were calling computer generated art at the time, and especially in photography and in printmaking. And, that type of work still exists and those technologies still exist, but it didn't mean that visual arts went out of business because of it. I think these things find their level over time. I think that there's always going to be a desire, but perhaps even an innate need for communal live performances. And the format that those take and the tools that people use may change over the years, and I'm sure they will. But I think that expressing your own experiences and sensibilities through song, lyric, and painting is, an essential part of the human condition, and I don't see that going away anytime soon.
I'll leave it to y'all to address the following. What do y'all think New Orleans gets right, and what do you think it gets wrong when it comes to supporting this economic engine of musicians and visual artists, and even in the food industry? Because I find there's a certain intellectual property aspect even among the restaurant industry.
Okay, I can go first. I think New Orleans will show up. We have a good friend of ours, Lou Hill, who's with the band Waterseed, and he's a touring musician. He teaches our crescendo program that we do every fall. And he always talks about how he's played in a lot of different cities. He lived in Atlanta for a long time. And New Orleans people will go to clubs and they will show up where that might not in other communities. I mean, my experience producing a lot of art in the park type festivals has been the same. People like to come out. I think the same thing is true of restaurants. Restaurants are obviously something that people really treasure and they really enjoy the dining scene of New Orleans. And sure, there are going to be people that are always going to be looking for the hip new place like they could be in other cities where it's part of a trend. But a lot of it is really just they get a lot of their enjoyment that way. And so I think that we center the enjoyment of live music, of festivals, of participating in visual arts and food in a way that is quite lovely, and I think is good for both the citizens and the artists alike. That said, the other issues are ones that we've addressed. I think that the city and the state of a whole have not put nearly as much effort into arts education as they should. I think that they lack in funding, and as we talked about earlier, they still don't really get the picture of this as an economic development engine. That film tax incentives are nice for a very select few, but that's not what's actually going to drive the creation of a cultural economy. What's going to drive the creation of a cultural economy is making sure that the support mechanisms are in place for developing artists, writers, musicians. And we're part of that. We're a nonprofit, and organizations like ours need to be supported. We play a focused but integral role in the arts ecosystem here as a service provider. And there are other organizations that do so similarly. And it's essential that those organizations get support from the citizens and from the government.
Ashlye, what do you think New Orleans gets right and wrong?
I actually agree completely with Gene. I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay.
See what we don't repeat them.
Okay. Then I'll ask you a different question. Being
Okay.
being an attorney, if you could change one law or a policy, whether it's at the municipal or state level, what would you modify that you think would actually have, beneficial ripple effects across the city and the state?
Wow, that's a big one. I have to think about that to give a real intelligible answer, but when you're there's I would change a lot of laws. I would
Okay.
change just so many of them. But one of the things that comes to mind when you when you asked about policy, and I went straight to the municipal ordinances, is I would I would take all of the municipal ordinances and I'd clean them up. That is something that I definitely do. I don't know that it's number one on my list of things to do, and that would have like, the greatest impact, as opposed to other ideas that have not popped into my head yet. But
Could you
I
give some
say
examples of ones you would clean up?
all of them, almost all of them, because the problem is that, what, when you talk about impact, I think that it would have a lot. I think that it would impact not just artists, but everyone, to have, to overhaul all of the municipal ordinances, bring them up to date, reconcile them, and so that, everyone understands what laws are actually enforceable and which ones are not. And that is something that has not been done. And New Orleans is way too old of a city for that. There's so many bad laws that are still on the books, and that a person with maybe in law enforcement who might not have the greatest amount of integrity will use as a weapon when they decide that they want to, because it's still the law, right? And there's been a lot of there's been a lot of informal, not rescission, but informal action in connection with some of these archaic laws that impact, impact our culture. But, that's not good enough. The lawyer in me would go through the municipal code, and I would bring it up to date for the first time in 300 years. So,
Ashley, as we come here to a close, you're a transplant. You came a couple of decades ago. You stayed.
mhm.
The city's poor. It's got a huge multi-million dollar deficit, crumbling infrastructure, as you've pointed out, vulnerable to hurricanes. People like to point out the crime. And then the press likes to talk about how it's going to be underwater here. Why do you stay?
Um, I stayed because of the very, very culture that Gene and I work hard every day to support in the way that we do. That is the number one reason why I'm here. There's something magical about the city, and there's a reason why it's filled up with a bunch of weird people, and I'm a weird person, and I fit in here. So I love it. I love it. But I do worry about the look and feel of the city as time goes on. And part of that is probably just, me getting old, but I wonder if it still has the allure that it used to. And I'm afraid it doesn't. I know that it's still alluring and it's still
Yes.
appealing, and I still love it, but it's not the same New Orleans I moved to. And I realize that, that comes with time, but it's markedly different. And I think that I don't know. I hope New Orleans. I hope the thing that makes New Orleans so special, that the thing that I don't think any of us can really point to. We can say, the culture is thriving and it's got a great music scene and, the great food scene and all that. But there's something kind of almost like mystical about the city that you can't really just put your finger on, right? And it's in large part the culmination of all those experiences and the way that it, affects your senses. And I hope that sort of that mystique, that it's that it stays alive in the city. But I fear that it's there's a lot of compromise to it.
Gene, as a native New Orleanian, what would you tell people? A reason to move to New Orleans.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ashley really crystallized it very nicely. I mean, it it is a place that there's nowhere else it's necessarily like. And if you fit in, not only are you going to fit in the city, but you quickly find yourself not really able to fit in with anywhere else in America very effectively. And so then it becomes, well, I don't really have a choice anymore because I can't get quite back to that feeling that as she said, you can't always even put into proper words. I mean, there is a sensual element to the city, and it really is quite lovely. And I think that being someone who is native and invested in it, and we're leaders in our field, we do have to look at that with eyes wide open, though. And so we do have to identify that there is missed opportunity, that there are missed opportunities, that there is potential that is perhaps not being best taken advantage of, and not just in the cultural sector, but in all the other issues that make it a challenging place as well. But at the same time, we also, I think, get to give ourselves some grace. It's not going to be something that is going to necessarily be fixed in 5 years either. A lot of the issues that we see, they didn't happen overnight, and they're not going to be fixed overnight, whether that be inequality, whether that be environmentalism, whether even that be in infrastructure. But I do think we do need to try. I think the place is important. I think it's a beacon for so many people around the world, and especially in the southern United States, where for many years it was unique in the southern United States as a place where you could go if you didn't quite fit in, or if you loved people that people thought you shouldn't love, or if you dressed the way they thought you shouldn't dress. And fortunately, the rest of the South has become more tolerant over time, but this is still the original,
Yeah.
and I think that if we take care of it, the city's eternal, and I hope that we do.
So, final question for both y'all, and we'll start with Jean and then finish with Ashley. And how the Ella project has evolved, and where would y'all like to see it in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so I think one of the keys with Ella Project is that we do know our role, and we do want to make sure that we stay mission focused. And so, we are first and foremost an artist services organization. We want to provide services to artists using the skills that we have in law, in business, in marketing, to allow them to be able to put their work out there. We're not people who are going to create our own artwork. And we're not people that are going to end up so far afield of other nonprofit social service endeavors because potentially that's where the money is. I think that we know our role, and as I said, I think that our role is an integral part of the cultural infrastructure. So we are, as we always also say, a small but stable organization. I'm hoping and believe that will continue over the next 5 or 10 years. I don't see us getting too much larger, but I do believe we will continue to be stable as long as we can continue to stay relevant. And that's where, there may be tweaks, of course. We start programs, we end programs, but the core element is going to remain. We're going to be a service that focuses on legal services for artists, that's based around intellectual property, that's based around allowing them to compete in the global marketplace, and it's based around advocacy for broader public support of the arts financially and in other sectors as well. I don't see us changing from that mission, and I think that mission is going to remain relevant.
Ashley?
Yeah, no, I agree with Jean wholeheartedly. I always say that, ideally in 5 or 10 years, we won't be needed, right? So we won't exist as a nonprofit, but the reality is that, absent like a huge swing of the pendulum, which it would have to be like uncanny. Our services are going to continue to be needed, and so as long as we are, able to, render those services effectively, and we maintain the trust of our constituency, and continue to act as honest brokers on behalf of, the community that we represent, then I think we'll be in a good place.
Ashley, Jean, I definitely appreciate the time you've given me to talk to us about the Ella Project, your particular contributions, your thoughts about New Orleans and the cultural ecosystem there. If you have any parting thoughts, please share. Anything?
We just really appreciate you taking the time and your probing questions. And, for people listening outside the city, come check it out. Because as I said, if it does click with you, you're not going to find any other place like it.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for hosting us.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on Brungart Law's Lagniappe, where we provide a little extra perspective, because the devil's always in the details. Invite others to listen. Let us know what you think. Ashlye, Jean, again, gratitude.
Thank you. Thank you so much.